At the United Nations this week, the Palestinians, led by President Mahmoud Abbas, have arrived, formally demanding official recognition and membership. It's a move fiercely opposed by the Israelis and the White House.
The only way of getting a lasting solution is through direct negotiations between the parties, and the route to that lies in Jerusalem and Ramallah, not in New York.
At the heart of the Palestinian effort is this man, Nabil Shaath. Senior PLO negotiator for more than 20 years, he's been dealing with Israelis, Americans and Europeans alike, searching for statehood. His frustrations are evident.
It's utterly ridiculous to negotiate with the Israelis an exchange of land for peace when there is no peace and the land is vanishing piece by piece. It's ridiculous.
I sat down with Nabil Shaath to discuss the prospects for a Palestinian state, his views of President Obama and where things stand right now. You have been present, engaged, observer status, however you like to describe it, in this whole Palestinian struggle for many decades. You've seen it go from the legendary 3 no's through the hope of peace, through endless frustrations of peace. And now we stand at the doors of the UN with a lot of bluster and a lot of noise. Where are we in real terms? When you consider that arc of the past 50 years, where do we stand today?
We are at an impasse. And the impasse today is caused, obviously, by a total inability of the United States, or lack of will by the United States, to get the Israelis to the negotiating table on relevant terms of reference and time schedule, and use America's influence to get the Israelis to really and seriously negotiate a 2-state solution.
There are 2 major points already in what you have said, implicit in what you said. Let's take them one by one. One is that the impasse that you have described means that the UN appeal by the Palestinians won't change anything. Is that your opinion?
No, I'm not saying that. I'm saying the impasse is leading to new weapons, one of which is going to the United Nations. But for 20 years, we were embedded to an American-driven peace process. Basically, from the time Mr. Bush the father, started that peace process until the time it's almost a total failure. This was an American-driven peace process.
All right, so we're not at a complete impasse. There may be, we'll come on to that later, but the other element of what you said was President Obama has been unable to bring the Israelis to the negotiating table. Now, Benjamin Netanyahu spoke only very recently, in which what he said seemed in many ways to contradict what he told the US Congress, but we'll leave that aside. He said to the Arabic media, everything is on the table. He's sitting there waiting with open arms to welcome a Palestinian negotiator. Netanyahu said this. So as far as his current media stance is concerned, he is ready to come to the negotiating table, and it's the Palestinians' problem. I mean, how do you address that?
He's bloody ready to do what? He is colonizing every bit of Palestine, Judaizing, de-Arabizing our Jerusalem. I mean by that East Jerusalem. He is controlling, like a control freak, every bit of Palestinian life. He is putting under a draconian siege 1.5 million Palestinians in Gaza by land, by air and by sea. He is suggesting totally new terms of reference, such as accept Israel as an exclusive state for the Jews, jeopardizing 1.5 million Palestinian, Israeli, Christians and Muslims, and the right of Palestinians to refugees. He is doing everything possible to show us that there's absolutely no chance that we'll get anything out of his peace process.
Just as a side issue, why do you think this Jewish state element has suddenly come up? And why do you think people like Alain Juppé in France and so many of the Westerners are suddenly standing up to back it as a reasonable assumption?
The West, with the inability, with the impotence of the United States policy, the rest of the Western countries are trying to find ways and means of playing some role, and they think that they can do so by not looking like they are pro-Palestinian. They've been accused by the Israelis, especially Western Europe, as being supporters of the Palestinians. So they always look for things that the Israelis ask for, that they may, in their mind, make them look more balanced. But that is ridiculous, because we've been in this process for 20 years. The Israelis just remembered to add in new demand for a Jewish state. It was not a demand by Mr. Netanyahu when he was prime minister between 1996 and 1999. It was never in the roadmap or in any other document signed by us and the Israelis. And so it comes today as an additional barricade, as an additional barrier that makes moving on the peace process impossible.
But the right wing is still saying that it's the Palestinian side that are really not coming to the table. They're the ones putting the problems in the way by, for instance, and this is one of the claims that was made only recently, continuing to broadcast hate on television, continuing to demand action and violence, and continuing to train their youth in hating the Israelis and going away from the peace process.
It's a bloody lie. I mean, there are people who have been monitoring our TV and every other word that comes out of any of our leaders. We talk about nothing but nonviolent struggle. There's absolutely no racist hate, no hatred of Jews.
But I think the point here being that maybe the leadership is saying this, but actually in practice what the civil society is doing.
No practice whatsoever. No practice whatsoever. There is absolutely no attempt by Hamas or Fatah today to wage any violent war against the Israelis by words or by deeds. It's the other way around. It's what the Israelis are saying and doing. There is the difference. I mean, they are saying and doing, and they claim we are saying to make it look like it's sort of the two sides are equally guilty.
But isn't this, in essence, the nub of the past 50 years of debate, is that for the average viewer who doesn't have the time to study the minutiae of a long and tortured history, they're going to sit there and watch you saying this and Netanyahu saying the other and say, well, it's just a case of he said, she said, we don't know which side to choose.
They don't really have to do that. This is ridiculous. I mean, they have just to look at what the status now is and where has it been 100 years ago. What the status is today is that a country called Israel, which created legitimacy for itself on 78% of our land occupied by them in 1948 as a result of the failure of the British government, which was really had an arrangement by the United Nations to prepare us for independence. Instead of preparing us for independence, they handed 78% of Palestine to the Zionist organization that created a state called Israel. That state called Israel, which controlled 78% of our land, in 1967 occupied the rest of Palestine, and today is still in full occupation, military occupation, and siege of that Palestine, despite the end of the colonization period of the world. There are no more colonies in the world. And this part of our land, which was occupied in 1967, which is 22% of our land, is the land we're contesting to be our state, our independent state, and the Israelis are refusing to do so. And the Israelis are doing that despite the fact that we have been negotiating with them for 20 years.
Let me just go back to something you said earlier on. Obama's failure to persuade Israel back to the negotiating table. There was so much hope attached to President Obama. Cairo filled everybody with a sense of hope. Where do you think that went? And how do you see Obama in this situation? Is he a serious player? Is he serious about what he says he wants to achieve?
I love the man. I really went into all kinds of statements to convince everybody that this is the next president of the United States. And when he won the Senate seat, I think I don't have any doubt neither about his principles or his morality or his commitment to justice, his commitment to peace. These are not the issue. I think the man most likely hates Mr. Netanyahu's speech in Congress and what Mr. Netanyahu is doing in Palestine. But that's not the issue. In realpolitik, the issue for the President of the United States is his priorities. And we're not his priority.
But if he had been serious, I mean, he certainly are not his priority. He has a re-election to think of. But
not re-election, but before that.
But couldn't he have put people in place to deal with the issue who were not the immediate remnants of the previous administration, who are not people who have clearly demonstrated which side they are on in the past? He could have chosen different negotiators, couldn't he?
I don't know. He didn't really have much time. I mean, between the time he decided to go into the Palestine issue, his speech in Cairo, his speech in Istanbul, and all the serious, I believe it was a serious talk of him about the peace process, requiring a total end to settlement activities. Because it's utterly ridiculous to negotiate with the Israelis an exchange of land for peace when there is no peace and the land is vanishing piece by piece. It's ridiculous. You can't really negotiate on this basis. And he caught this very early in the game, saying that these settlements have to stop completely.
And he gave up on it very fast.
Okay. The question is, by the time there came a test of wills, because in the final analysis, again, the Israelis, typically as an occupier with a huge military force, the Israelis are the fourth largest air force in the world. The Israelis, as atomic bombs, are probably the third stockpiling of atomic bombs country in the world. They are 30 times our per capita income. They depend entirely on American technology and American support. So you really need to look them in the eyes and tell them you've got to do it. And that means using all the influence of the United States. It has been done flagrantly twice in history, and less flagrantly 3 other more times. And Mr. Eisenhower in 1956 told the Israelis, the British, and the French, get the hell out of Egypt and the Sinai. And they did. He used really words that none of the 3 could have ignored. And again, Mr. Bush, the father, in 1991, told Mr. Shamir, go to the peace process in Madrid or else you lose $10 billion of loan guarantees. And I mean it. And that includes building in Jerusalem, and not only building in the West Bank and Gaza alone. And Mr. Shamir went kicking and screaming to a peace process that's lasted for 20 years. These were very obvious cases of America using its clout.
How do you respond to the claim that this apparent healing of the rifts between Fatah and Hamas is just a way of Hamas insinuating its existential threat into the PA structure and taking over and creating a broader front of violence and aggression?
They were not able to do much really with their military takeover in Gaza, and I think they realized this. They realized that this is not the time or the way to...
They may not have the technology now, but introducing the ideology back into the mainstream of Palestinian politics is what the Israelis claim to fear.
The question is not about ideology. The question is about government and methods used to obtain government. If it was the ballot box, we have no problem. The question is not the ballot box, it's question the bullet box that was used to take over Gaza. Had it been just a question of who has a majority in parliament and what can you do with this majority? And
I'm not sure what you're saying there, but my question here is Hamas's refusal and continued hard line going to scupper whatever modest possibility of progress?
Where is the hard line? Hamas in Cairo was very clear. We are committing to their hudna, which is non-violence, for as long as it would take. They told Mr. Abbas publicly in Mr. Mish'al's speech, President Abbas, you have been negotiating for 18 years, and if you think it's still worthwhile, why don't you continue for a year or two? What is equivocal about their saying our goal is creation of an independent Palestinian state in the West Bank and Gaza with East Jerusalem, its capital? They have really come such a long way in saying we want to be united as Palestinians under the banner of the project. What
then is the block to them going the entire way and just dropping the offensive elements of the charter and blocking the aggressive calls for the destruction of Israel?
Took 18 months for the Lebanese to form a government after having agreed about everything. Forming a government sometimes becomes the litmus test of where you right before coming to agreement or where you're wrong and you lost. And Hamas thinks that it's time to have a new prime minister altogether. Abu Mazen thinks that continuing Salam Fayyad until the election just maintains things going until the people decide on the election. The difference is not about armed struggle, the difference is not about Hudna, it's not about the final objectives, it's about the requirements of translating that step by step into a viable, united government. I'm not at all pessimistic, and I think that eventually this will be worked out, and I think that Hamas is serious and we are serious.
There's been an interesting year across the Arab world, and the use of non-violent demonstrations has opened an entirely new set of circumstances across the Arab world. And now Mahmoud Abbas has called for the same practice here.
It's
for
not
people
now,
to come out
but
on
he's
the streets.
just repeating it now.
Okay, is it going to happen? And if it does, what do you see the results as being?
But that's precisely why we're going to the United Nations. We have decided, it is not yet to be decided, we have decided to follow a non-violent struggle course.
Aren't people going to turn out into the streets in their millions?
Why not? Why not? They went into millions in Liberation Square.
Sure.
And the only body who used force was the police force, not the demonstrators' force. I mean, demonstrators were in every country in the Middle East in which a spring arose, with the exception of Libya, where it turned into a military fight. But if you leave aside Libya, the force of public pressure, totally nonviolent, is immense. And I think it was demonstrated by Gandhi, in the famous, in his famous struggle against the British Empire. It was demonstrated by Mandela in South Africa, by the Martin Luther King in the United States. It works. By the Serbs against Milosevic lately. I mean,
so after your 50-odd years in this entire process, do you really think that we suddenly are at a point where this simple precedent that was set by Gandhi and is only just being brought into play here will be the thing that gives Palestine an independent state?
It will really put the kind of necessary pressure that the Americans failed to do in order to bring us to a situation where going back to negotiations become real, productive, useful, where we really have to end that with going back to negotiations, obviously. But you cannot go to negotiations today on the basis of this extremely imbalanced situation where the United States
is
not
but
there.
I'm just wondering, I mean, you personally believe that very few people over the course of the existence of the State of Israel have been serious about granting Palestine an independent state. You don't think that there's been any degree of commitment on both sides to a large extent to creating a two-state solution. But are you saying now that you think that despite that, we're going to see the creation of a two-state solution eventually come about through these means?
Look, it has been difficult. It's a whole century of struggle against incipient, continued expansion into our country of really what is a settler colonialism that brings in settlers and expels Palestinians from their land. This has been going on for a century. And we tried armed struggle, and I think it was useful at least in bringing our cause to the world, that we are a people with rights. And we tried negotiations for 20 years. And when the Americans' balancing role went out, it became futile. And therefore, you need a new strategy. You cannot give up. We will not give up. These people will not give up, the Palestinians. And therefore, the new strategy is simply that. It's nonviolent struggle at home. It's nonviolent struggle by international action. It's continuing to build the institutions of the state as if the state is coming tomorrow, in effect. And it is a seeking of unity, because without it, it will be very difficult to achieve any of the above. And this quadripartite strategy is what we have all agreed, and Mr. Abbas has made it very clear. We're committed to nonviolence, we're committed to eventually going back to negotiations, we're committed to the borders of 67 as a dividing line, recognizing Israel on the other side of the border. And these are the requirements, the three important requirements for eventually getting back to negotiation.
Let's assume for a moment that Benjamin Netanyahu is able and willing to deliver the Israeli cabinet on an agreement as you have outlined. How do you think the settlers would respond if a deal like that was signed?
You think that's our problem too?
No, I'm just wondering, because would a deal like that actually bring about an end to conflict, I guess is what I'm saying, because not all parties will be happy with it.
No. Look, nobody is seeking absolute justice. I mean, absolute justice at this time is unachievable. We're seeking relative justice. We have accepted that if we have truly independent and sovereign, peaceful, democratic state on the border of 67 in Gaza and the West Bank, with a free passage between Gaza and the West Bank, and a serious attempt at resolving the Palestinian refugee issue by return or compensation, that this will lead us to not only a separate state, but serious cooperation between these two states in making Palestine and Israel a very prosperous and neighborly, peaceful two countries with a lot of ability, technological and otherwise, lots of extension to the Arab world. The Arab peace process says that when this happens, not only all the Arabs, but all the 57 Muslim countries, as approved by the OIC, will also recognize Israel and Palestine and will also normalize their relationship with them. I think this is an immensely better status than the status we or the Israelis are in today.
Just finish with one final question. I mean, you seem optimistic after all this time. Just very quickly describe to me the arc of your personal emotions over the course of this entire process and where you find yourself now.
I'm now 73 years old. I was forced with my family out of Palestine when I was 10 years old, out of Jaffa, which is part of Israel today. It's been a long, long time. And I've seen at one time that we became not only homeless, not only refugees, but our cause just dwindled almost to nothing. And I see it today, the cause of everybody in the world. I don't think there is a more important peace process in the world than the importance of the Palestinian-Israeli peace. We are at the center of the universe today. Our people are much more in numbers, but much more in quality, education, and ability. And we are inside. Leadership and people are inside. There are still lots of refugees outside, just like the Irish or the Armenians, many other people. But there is a project for a state that will somehow make our independence real, make our future possible, and gives a real chance for our refugees to decide for themselves what they would want to do. So that is the source of my optimism. And I have seen how peace could work between 1992 and 1996, 2 years before we signed the agreement and 2 years after it. I've seen how the Israelis can also be drawn into hope, a real hope that brings real results. Between 1994 and 1996, the Israelis had the greatest economic growth in their history, and they also had the biggest number of countries recognizing them ever in their history. And so it is doable, it's possible. I've seen it work and I've seen it fail. And I've seen that you've got to be dynamic and use varieties of means to achieve it. But I see that it's doable. I never lost hope of seeing it done. And when it's done, our people will be delivered, will be freer, will have real choices. And I think the Israelis too.
Thank you for talking to us.